They told her politics was a man's room, smoke thick, loud, and locked from the inside. She walked in anyway, not with a slogan, not with a fist on the table, but with a voice that could turn a hostile crowd quiet. And the cruel contrast is this. The woman who would one day stand in Australia's parliament began life in a house where the future could be measured in loaves of bread, in unpaid bills, in how long the fire would last before the cold won again. Enid Burnell was born on 9th July 1897 in Smithen, on Tasmania's far northwest edge, country of rain, timber, and hard distances. The map makes it look small. The reality was bigger. Isolation that could swallow ambition whole. Her father, William Burnell, worked as a school teacher and later in various jobs. Her mother, Eliza, held the family together with the quiet, relentless mathematics of survival. Enid grew up watching adults speak in lowered voices about money, about work, about what might happen if the next pay didn't come. Childhood for her wasn't a soft place. It was training. She was bright, quick with words, quick with memory. But brilliance doesn't automatically buy you freedom, especially not for a girl at the turn of the century. Tasmania in those years could feel like a closed circuit. You were born into a station in life, and you stayed there. Yet Enid had something that made people lean in when she spoke. She could tell a story. She could make a point without sounding like she was trying to win. And that, in a world that punished women for being too bold, was a kind of stealth power. The family moved around, and Enid's schooling was interrupted and reshaped by circumstance. She attended schools in Tasmania, including in Hobart, and like many girls of her era, the path ahead was supposed to narrow into something suitable. But Enid didn't fit neatly into the expected shapes. She read widely. She listened. She watched how authority worked, who was allowed to speak, who was expected to nod. Then came the moment that would tilt her entire life onto a different track. In 1915, she met Joseph Lyons. He was already a rising figure, a teacher turned politician, a labor man with a reputation for warmth and a gift for connecting with ordinary people. He was also older, 17 years older than Enid. In another story, that age gap might be the scandal. In this one, it's the fuse. Because when Enid and Joseph met, it wasn't simply romance. It was the collision of two forces, his public trajectory and her private intensity. She was 18, he was 35. And within a year, they were married on 28th April 1916. Imagine the speed of it. 1 year, you're a young woman in Tasmania, still close enough to girlhood that people speak over your head. The next, you're the wife of a man whose life is public, whose decisions are argued about in newspapers, whose name is spoken with. Approval in some rooms and suspicion in others. Enid didn't just marry Joseph Lyons. She married the storm that came with him. And the storm grew. Joseph's political career accelerated. He became Premier of Tasmania in 1923. That meant Enid, still in her 20s, was suddenly living at the center of a state's political life. The official functions, the dinners, the endless handshakes, those were the visible parts. The invisible part was harder. The constant pressure to be perfect, to be pleasant, to never show strain. And Enid's life was already filling with strain. Because while Joseph's public responsibilities expanded, Enid's private responsibilities multiplied at a pace that would break many people. She became a mother again and again. In total, she would have 12 children. 12. Let that number land. Not as a statistic, but as a daily reality. Pregnancies, births, sleepless nights, illnesses, meals, laundry, schooling, the emotional, weather of a household that never truly rested. And here is the first sharp twist in her story. The woman history would later celebrate as a political pioneer was for years trapped. In the most demanding form of invisibility, she was doing work that never ended and was rarely counted. She was building a life that made Joseph's possible, while the world applauded him for it. Yet even then, she was not silent. Enid began to write and speak publicly. She had opinions about family, about society, about responsibility. She was a Catholic convert, and her faith shaped her moral framework, but she was not simply repeating doctrine. She was thinking in public. She wrote articles and gave talks, developing a voice that was both intimate and commanding. She could speak about motherhood without romanticizing it, about duty without sounding like a scold. People listened because she sounded like someone who had actually lived what she was describing. In the 1920s, the Lyons family moved to the mainland as Joseph entered federal politics. In 1929, he became a minister in the Scullin Labour government. Canberra at that time was still young, still rough around the edges, more a work site than a capital. But the stakes were enormous. The Great Depression hit like a blunt instrument. Jobs vanished, savings evaporated. Families who had been stable were suddenly one bad week away from hunger. And inside government, the pressure turned political colleagues into enemies. Joseph Lyons faced the defining conflict of his career, the split within the Labour Party over economic policy. The arguments weren't abstract. They were about whether to cut spending, how to respond to debt, what sacrifices were acceptable. The party fractured. Friendships snapped. Careers ended. Joseph broke with Labour, and in 1931 became a leading figure in the new United Australia Party. It was a political earthquake. Enid was not a passive bystander to this. She was living the consequences in real time, watching the public turn, watching newspapers sharpen their knives, watching former allies become bitter opponents. She saw what it cost to stand against your own side, and she learned something crucial. Politics wasn't just speeches and votes. It was endurance. It was the ability to keep moving while people tried to freeze you into a caricature. In 1932, Joseph Lyons became Prime Minister of Australia. Enid was now the Prime Minister's wife, living in the lodge, raising a huge family under national scrutiny. The image could have been simple. The smiling mother, the supportive spouse, the symbol of domestic stability in a country shaken by economic fear. But the reality was more complicated and more cinematic. Picture it. A woman in her 30s, surrounded by children, managing a household that functioned like a small institution, while outside the gates the nation argued about unemployment, austerity, and the future. Every public appearance was a performance with consequences. Every misstep could be weaponized. And the press, especially in that era, could be merciless. A man could be strong. A woman could be shrill. A man could be decisive. A woman could be ambitious, said like an accusation. Enid learned to navigate that double standard with precision. She cultivated warmth without surrendering intelligence. She became known for her speaking ability, for her capacity to connect with audiences. She traveled, she addressed gatherings, she represented the country in ways that were unofficial but influential. She was, in effect, doing politics, without being allowed to call it that. And then the clock began to tick in a way she could not control. Joseph Lyons' health was not invincible. The stress of leadership, the relentless schedule, the weight of the Depression years, and then the gathering shadows of global conflict, these things take a toll. Enid could see it up close. The fatigue, the strain, the moments when the body reveals what the public mass tries to hide. She was watching the man at the center of the nation's government slowly being worn down by the job. At the same time, her own life was tightening around a brutal contradiction. She was expected to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Present for her children, present for her husband, present for the public, and yet never visibly exhausted, never angry, never overwhelmed. The country wanted a symbol. Symbols don't get to collapse. But Enid was not made of porcelain. She was made of will. She kept speaking. She kept writing. She kept learning the machinery of public life from the inside. How decisions were shaped, how alliances formed, how reputations were built and destroyed. She was absorbing the rules of a game she was not yet permitted to play. And then in 1939, the world lurched toward war. Australia, tied to Britain, felt the pull of Europe's crisis. The political atmosphere thickened with urgency. Leadership mattered more than ever. The Prime Minister's schedule became heavier, the stakes sharper. Enid could feel the nation's mood changing. Less patience, more fear, more need for certainty. And in that tightening atmosphere, the personal and the political were about to collide with devastating force. Because the truth, quietly known in the family, not always spoken aloud in public, was that Joseph Lyons was running out of time. Enid didn't have the luxury of denial. She had children watching their father. She had a country watching its leader. She had a household that depended on her steadiness. And she had her own mind, which had been preparing, almost without permission, for something more than the role she'd been assigned. The tension in her life was no longer just about public expectations. It was about an approaching absence. About what happens when the center of your world, the man whose career shaped your entire adult life, begins to falter, and you realize that the next chapter, whatever it is, will not wait for you to be ready. She had entered politics through marriage, through proximity, through the side door history left open. But the side door can become a trap if it's the only one you're allowed to use. And Enid Lyons, standing in the bright glare of national attention, was nearing the moment when she would have to decide whether she would remain a figure beside power or step into power herself with everything, grief, judgment, and time, closing in. The night Joseph Lyons died, the country didn't just lose a prime minister. Enid Lyons lost the one person who had been both her shelter and her shadow. And here's the brutal contrast that makes her story burn. For more than 2 decades, she had been trained, by necessity, by motherhood, by public scrutiny, to hold everything together. But no one trains you for the moment the center disappears. No one hands you a script for what to do when the nation's grief becomes your private catastrophe. And the next morning, the newspapers still need a headline. April 1939, Joseph Lyons collapses and dies suddenly while still in office. He becomes the first Australian prime minister to die in office. The shock is national, but inside the Lyons family, it is a kind of detonation. Enid is 41. She has a house full of children, 12 in total across her life, with the youngest still small, and now she is a widow in the harshest possible spotlight. The lodge, once a symbol of stability, turns into a place where footsteps echo. The public sees black clothes and solemn faces. Enid feels the raw arithmetic of survival. School fees, food, futures, and the terrifying question that arrives like a cold hand on the neck. What happens now? Because the system that applauded her as the prime minister's wife is not designed to catch her when she falls. It is designed to move on. And it does. Politics doesn't pause for mourning. Within days, the government reshuffles, the parties reposition, the country braces for war. Europe is already on fire. Australia is watching the horizon. The men in suits keep walking, keep talking, keep deciding. Enid is expected to step back into the shadows with dignity, to become a memory that behaves. But Enid Lyons has never been only what people expected. She had spent years learning the machinery of power from the inside, watching how decisions were made, how reputations were manufactured, how a single phrase could turn a crowd. She had traveled, spoken, written, represented. She had been the unofficial voice that could soften a hard policy, the human face that could make a government feel like a family. And now with Joseph gone, something strange happens. The very skills that had been acceptable in a prime minister's wife suddenly look dangerous in a widow. Because a widow who speaks is harder to control. At first, she does what duty demands. She grieves. She holds her children together. She navigates the rituals of public loss, condolences, ceremonies, the endless repetition of Joseph's name, as if saying it often enough might keep him present. But behind the veil of mourning, another reality presses in. She needs an income. Not a symbolic allowance, not polite charity, real security. The kind that doesn't vanish when public sympathy moves on to the next crisis. And then the war arrives like a deadline. September 1939, Australia enters the Second World War. The country's mood changes overnight. Fear, urgency, sacrifice. Men enlist, families fracture. The political class hardens. And in that atmosphere, Enid's voice, calm, maternal, disciplined, becomes valuable again. She begins speaking more, writing more, appearing more, not as decoration, as persuasion, as morale, as a bridge between policy and kitchen tables. But there's a catch. The same society that wants her voice in wartime still doesn't want her in Parliament. Enid is pulled into a contradiction that would crush a less stubborn person. She is famous, respected, listened to, yet officially powerless. She can influence, but she cannot vote on laws. She can rally, but she cannot sit at the table where decisions are signed. She is close enough to touch the levers, but not allowed to pull them. And then comes the unexpected turn. The door opens, not out of generosity, but out of political necessity. In 1943, the Liberal Party is formed, reshaping the non-Labour side of Australian politics. Robert Menzies, who had briefly been Prime Minister after Joseph's death, is rebuilding. The Conservative forces are reorganizing, trying to find a voice that can compete with Labour's wartime dominance under John Curtin. They need credibility. They need a symbol that can cut through cynicism. They need someone the public already trusts. They need Enid Lyons, but Enid doesn't walk into this lightly. She knows what politics does to families. She has watched it eat time, health, privacy. She has lived the cost, and she has children, still children, who have already lost their father to the job. If she steps forward, she is not just choosing a career. She is choosing a new kind of exposure for her family, a new kind of risk. And yet the pressure of time is merciless. War compresses everything. The future feels like it's being decided in real time. And if you're not in the room, you're being decided for. So she runs. In 1943, Enid Lyons stands for the House of Representatives seat of Darwin in Tasmania. The campaign is not gentle. Australia has never had a woman in the federal lower house. The idea itself is treated by some as novelty, by others as threat. There are men who smile at her as if she's a guest who has wandered into the wrong hall. There are critics who reduce her to her motherhood, 12 children, as if that is either proof she can't think or proof she shouldn't be allowed to. There are whispers that she is only a name, only a widow's halo, only borrowed authority, and Enid answers the only way she knows how, by speaking until the room changes. She doesn't pretend to be one of the men. She doesn't imitate their aggression. She uses what she has, clarity, warmth, moral force, and a kind of steel that doesn't need to shout. She talks about families because she has lived the brutal logistics of family life. She talks about sacrifice because she has buried the man who carried the country's weight. She talks about duty because she has done duty until it became muscle memory. And she wins. In August 1943, Enid Lyons becomes the first woman elected to the House of Representatives in the Parliament of Australia. On the same day, Dorothy Tangney becomes the first woman elected to the Senate. Two women enter a building designed by and for men, and the air changes, quietly but permanently. Now picture the scene. Enid walking into Parliament, not as a visitor, not as a spouse, but as a member. The chamber is a theater of tradition, voices trained to dominate, rules written in a language that assumes the speaker is male. She is watched the way pioneers are watched, with curiosity, with suspicion, with the hope, by some, that she will fail quickly so the experiment can be declared over. And the system tests her immediately, because being first is not a medal you wear. It's a target you carry. Every mistake becomes proof that women don't belong. Every hesitation is magnified. Every moment of emotion is judged as weakness, while the men's anger is called strength. She has to be twice as prepared to be considered half as legitimate. And she is doing this while still being a mother, still managing a household, still carrying grief that doesn't vanish just because you've been elected. Her conflict is no longer only with opponents across the aisle. It is with the culture of the place itself, an institution that smiles politely while resisting her presence in 1,000 small ways. Enid chooses her ground carefully. She speaks on social services, on family allowances, on the welfare of children, on the human consequences of policy. She is not naive about power. She understands that budgets and war strategy dominate the agenda. But she also understands something many politicians forget. Nations are not only defended by armies. They are held together by households, by food, rent, health, schooling, dignity, by whether ordinary people feel abandoned. And she brings that argument into the chamber with a steadiness that is hard to dismiss. Still, the war years are not kind to the opposition. Labor is strong, the country is focused on survival, and the non-labor parties are rebuilding. Enid is in Parliament, but not in government. She is inside the machine, but not at the controls. For someone with her experience, that could have been a slow suffocation, being present yet unable to shape outcomes. Then history shifts again. John Curtin dies in 1945. Ben Chifley becomes prime minister. The war ends, but the peace is complicated. Reconstruction, shortages, returning soldiers, a society trying to reassemble itself. Politics becomes a battle over what Australia will be in the new world, how much the state should provide, how much it should control, and what kind of security ordinary people can expect. Enid watches all of it with the eyes of someone who has lived both poverty and prominence. She knows what it means when governments talk about belt tightening. Son in our norm, she knows who feels it first. And she keeps building her authority, not through theatrics, but through persistence. She becomes a presence that cannot be waved away as symbolic. She is not there to decorate history. She is there to change what is possible. By 1949, the tension that has been rising for years reaches a political breaking point. Robert Menzies leads the Liberal Country Coalition into an election against Chifley's Labour government. The campaign is fierce, ideological, and deeply emotional. Post-war anxiety, fears of communism, arguments over nationalization, the shape of the welfare state. Australia is deciding what kind of country it wants to be. Enid is no longer the widow who entered Parliament as an exception. She is a seasoned parliamentarian, a public figure with a voice people recognize. She campaigns hard, not as a mascot, but as a weapon. One that can reach voters the party struggles to reach. The coalition wins. Menzies becomes prime minister again, beginning a long era. And suddenly, Enid Lyons is no longer just inside Parliament. She is on the edge of executive power. In 1949, she is appointed vice president of the Executive Council. It is a formal role, but the symbolism is electric. A woman in the Ministry of the Commonwealth of Australia. Not a helper, not a hostess, a minister. The first. For the men who believed the building would always belong to them, it is a quiet shock. For women watching from outside, women who have been told their place is the home, it is a crack in the wall you can see daylight through. But Enid knows better than anyone that first come with a price. The scrutiny intensifies, the expectations sharpen. If she succeeds, she will be called lucky. If she fails, she will be called proof. And the clock is still ticking, not only the political clock, but the personal one. She has spent her life racing time. Pregnancies, elections, crises, war, grief. Now she is racing age, stamina, and the relentless pace of public duty. She has fought her way into the room, but the room does not slow down for her. She stands there anyway, widow, mother, minister, carrying the weight of a country's assumptions on her shoulders and refusing to bend. Because the real twist in Enid Lyons' rise is this. She didn't enter politics to become a symbol. She entered because life left her no safe alternative. And once she was inside, she discovered something that would define the next phase of her story. Power is not only about holding office. It's about changing what the next person is allowed to imagine. And Enid Lyons, with war still echoing in the nation's bones and the old guard still watching for her to slip, is about to prove that her presence in Parliament was not a moment. It was a beginning. The first time Enid Lyons sat at the government table, it wasn't with a triumphant smile. It was with the cold awareness that history can turn on a single misstep and that the men around her were waiting for one. A woman in the ministry wasn't just unusual. To some, it was an intrusion. To others, a stunt. And to Enid, it was something far more dangerous, a chance that might never come again. Because her time was not infinite. She was in her early 50s now, carrying years that had been lived at double speed, 12 pregnancies across a lifetime, the grinding, logistics of a huge family, the public strain of being a prime minister's wife, the shock of widowhood, the war years, then the brutal apprenticeship of being the first in a parliament that treated her like a test case. She could feel the clock in her bones. Not melodramatically, practically. How many years of full strength did she have left? How many sessions, how many fights, how many late nights before exhaustion stopped being a feeling and became a limit? And the limit mattered, because the conflict she had stepped into wasn't a single opponent across the aisle. It was the institution itself, its habits, its assumptions, its quiet, constant pressure to make her smaller. In 1949, Robert Menzies returned to power and appointed her vice president of the Executive Council. The title sounded ceremonial, and in some ways it was, but the appointment did something that could not be undone. It put a woman inside the Ministry of the Commonwealth. It forced the system to look at what it had always excluded. It forced the press to write the words. It forced the public to picture it. And then almost immediately, the system tried to domesticate her again. Turn her into a symbol that smiled and nodded, while the real, outwardly decisions happened elsewhere. Enid refused to be parked. She had learned politics the hard way. Not from textbooks, but from kitchens and train platforms, from the relentless arithmetic of feeding children, from watching Joseph Lyons carry the nation's burdens until his heart gave out. She understood that power is often disguised as procedure, that the most important decisions are sometimes made in rooms where no speeches are given. And she understood something else too, something that made her uniquely dangerous to complacency. She could translate policy into human consequence with a clarity that made excuses sound obscene. So she chose her ground and kept moving. In Parliament, she pushed relentlessly on issues that were easy for male colleagues to sentimentalize and therefore ignore. Family, welfare, social services, the cost of living, the daily realities of women who were expected to hold the country together while being treated as politically irrelevant. She spoke about children not as a decorative theme, but as a national responsibility. She spoke about widows and pensions with the authority of someone who had stared into the financial cliff edge after Joseph died. She spoke about housing and prices with the impatience of someone who knew that economic adjustment meant cold rooms and empty cupboards. And she did it in a voice that didn't perform toughness. It didn't need to. Her strength was in the steadiness, the refusal to be embarrassed by compassion, the refusal to let the chamber pretend that private life was none of government's business. But the deeper fight was always there, humming under every debate. the fight to be taken seriously without becoming a caricature. If she was firm, she was shrill. If she was warm, she was motherly in a way that implied she couldn't be strategic. If she spoke about women's lives, she was accused of being narrow. If she spoke about national issues, she was treated as if she'd wandered out of her lane. The rules were rigged. She had to be exceptional just to be considered adequate. And then came the moment that turned the pressure into a deadline. In 1951, many's called a double dissolution election. The stakes were high, the atmosphere tense, and the government wanted to reshape the Senate. For Enid, it meant something else as well. Another campaign, another test, another stretch of life lived out of suitcases and speeches. She had already been through the war years, through the grief years, through the years of proving she belonged. Now she had to do it again, because politics, like grief, doesn't care how tired you are. She won, again, and with each victory, the contradiction sharpened. The public liked her. Many voters trusted her. Yet inside the building, the old reflexes remained. She was still introduced with a faint note of novelty, still watched for signs of weakness, still treated in subtle ways as if her presence needed justification. So she did what she had always done when cornered. She worked harder, and she made herself useful in ways that could not be dismissed. In 1956, she was appointed Minister for Social Services, the first woman in Australia to hold a cabinet-level portfolio. Now the job was no longer symbolic. Now it had teeth. Now she was responsible for a department that touched the lives of millions. Pensions, benefits, the safety net that caught people when life broke them. And here the story tightens, because this was the portfolio where her personal history and her political instincts collided head-on. With the machinery of government, social services is where ideals meet budgets, where compassion meets paperwork, where every promise becomes a line item and every line item becomes a fight. It is also where the public's need is endless, because suffering does not schedule itself politely around fiscal years. Enid walked into that office with a clear sense of what mattered. Dignity. Not charity, not pity, dignity. She had seen what it did to people to be treated as a burden. She had seen how quickly a family could slide from stability into panic. She had lived the terror of uncertainty. And she knew that a modern nation could not call itself decent while leaving its most vulnerable citizens to scramble in silence. But she also knew she was operating inside a conservative government that prized restraint, that feared dependency, that watched spending like a hawk. She was not a radical. She was not trying to tear down the system. Her fight was more surgical, and in some ways more difficult, to make the system humane without letting it collapse under its own caution. So she pushed for improvements in benefits and administration, for a more responsive approach to the people who depended on the department. She fought the slow cruelty of bureaucracy, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't hit, doesn't make headlines, but wears people down, with delays and suspicion and forms that seem designed to make you give up. And she did it while being judged by a harsher standard than any man in the same role. If she increased support, critics could accuse her of softness. If she tightened rules, critics could accuse her of betraying women. If she compromised, she could be called weak. If she stood firm, she could be called difficult. The margin for error was thin, and she could feel it. Then came one of the most revealing battles of her career. Not a dramatic showdown on the floor, but the constant, grinding resistance to the idea that women's issues were national issues, because Enid's presence forced a question the Parliament had avoided for decades. If women are citizens, why are their lives treated as a side topic? If mothers are essential to the nation's future, why are they expected to carry that responsibility with so little structural support? If families are the backbone of society, why is their welfare treated as sentimental rather than strategic? She didn't always win, no one does, but she changed the terms of the argument. She made it harder for colleagues to dismiss social policy as mere softness. She made it harder to pretend that the home was outside politics. She made it harder to keep women out of the story of the nation. And still, the institution kept trying to reduce her to a single image: the mother of 12, the widow of a prime minister, the first woman in the room. Enid understood the trap. A first can be celebrated in a way that neutralizes them, turned into a museum piece while they're still alive, praised for breaking a barrier, then quietly ignored when they try to change what's on the other side of it. So she kept speaking, kept writing, kept showing up. She had always been a communicator, and she used that skill like a tool. She wrote and spoke to the public in a way that made politics feel close, not abstract. She could make a policy debate sound like what it really was: a decision about whether someone eats, whether someone gets medicine, whether someone can keep their home. In an era when political language often hid behind formality, she insisted on plain meaning. But the cost was accumulating. By the late 1950s, the pace of public life had become a kind of slow violence. Travel, sessions, meetings, the constant expectation to be composed, the constant demand to represent not just a seat but an entire gender. She had been living under that weight since 1943, and before that, under the weight of being watched as the Prime Minister's wife. The strain didn't announce itself with a single dramatic collapse. It seeped in, fatigue, pressure, the sense that the years were narrowing. And then the unexpected turn arrived, not as scandal, not as defeat, but as a decision that startled people who assumed she would cling to office simply because she had fought so hard to get there. In 1958, Enid Lyons retired from Parliament. To some it looked like stepping back. To others it looked like surrender. But to understand it, you have to see the shape of her life. She had never chased power for its own sake. She had chased security when she needed it, influence when she could use it, and change when it was possible. She had entered politics because life had left her no safe alternative. And once inside, she had used the platform to widen the doorway for others. Retiring didn't erase what she had done. It underlined it. Because the real measure of her work wasn't only in the bills she touched or the portfolios she held. It was in the fact that after Enid Lyons, the idea of a woman in federal parliament could no longer be dismissed as fantasy. The building had been forced to adapt to a reality it had resisted. The public had been forced to see a woman not as a political accessory, but as a political actor. And perhaps the most dramatic image of all is also the simplest. A woman who had once been expected to pour tea and smile at dignitaries, had sat in the chamber, argued policy, held ministerial responsibility, and walked away on her own terms, without asking permission, and without apologizing for the space she had taken. Yet even as she left the floor of Parliament behind, the tension in her story didn't dissolve. Because the question she had raised, what kind of nation Australia wanted to be for its women, its families, its vulnerable, was still unresolved. The door had been cracked open, but the room beyond was not yet remade. And Enid Lyons, stepping out of the daily combat of politics, was about to discover that leaving office doesn't end a fight. Sometimes it changes the battlefield. When Enid Lyons walked out of Parliament in 1958, the building didn't slam the door behind her. It did something quieter and, in its own way, more brutal. It tried to forget her. Not with insults, not with a vote, with the soft, suffocating method institutions love most. Turning a living person into a finished story, a first, a pioneer, a framed photograph. A name that can be praised safely because it no longer argues back. But Enid was not finished, and time, her oldest opponent, was not done with her either. She had left the chamber because she understood something that many career politicians never learn. You can win a seat and still lose your life to it. The years of travel, the endless demands, the constant pressure to represent not just a constituency, but an entire sex. She could feel the cost. She had been running on urgency since she was a girl in Tasmania, since she became a mother before she was fully grown, since she watched Joseph Lyons carry the weight of a nation until his heart gave out. She knew what overwork looks like when it turns fatal. She had lived the aftermath. So she stepped away while she still had strength to choose her next move. And the next move was not silence. Outside Parliament, Enid's voice didn't shrink. It changed shape. She wrote, she spoke, she appeared. She kept her mind in the public arena, but now without the daily grind of divisions and party rooms. She had always been a communicator first, the woman who could take a policy and make it feel like a loaf of bread on a kitchen table, either there or not. Now she used that gift to keep pressing the same point she had hammered into the national conversation for decades, that the private lives of citizens are not private when government decisions decide whether those lives hold together. And then came the moment that proved the country hadn't forgotten her as much as it had tried to file her away. In 1960, Enid Lyons was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Dame Enid Lyons. It was meant as recognition. It was also, in a strange way, a test. Because honors can be a velvet trap, a way to reward someone while gently suggesting they stop making trouble. A way to say, thank you, now be decorative. Enid didn't become decorative. She accepted the title, but she didn't let it soften her edges. If anything, it sharpened the contrast that had always unsettled people. The sight of a woman who could be both warmly familiar and politically immovable. A dame who still spoke like someone who remembered the price of rent, the fear of illness, the humiliation of asking for help. A woman who had sat at the center of power and still refused to talk as if power were the point. And while the public saw the honor, Enid saw the clock. Because the truth is, retirement didn't remove the deadline. It made it louder. When you're in office, the calendar is filled for you. When you step out, you suddenly hear your own life again. The years behind you, the years ahead, and the thin, uncertain line between them. She had already outlived Joseph by more than 2 decades. She had raised a family so large it sounded like a statistic until you remembered it was made of individual children, each with their own needs, their own crises, their own futures. She had carried grief in public, which is a special kind of loneliness. And she had carried the strain of being watched, first as a prime minister's wife, then as a woman in parliament, then as a minister. The scrutiny never fully stops, it just changes its angle. Now, in the 1960s, Australia itself was changing. The country that had once treated a woman in politics as a novelty was slowly, unevenly, being forced to confront a new reality. More women were demanding education, work, autonomy, representation. The old assumptions were starting to crack, not because the system suddenly became enlightened, but because the pressure became impossible to ignore. And here's the twist that makes Enid's story more complicated than a simple Trailblazer label. Enid Lyons was not a modern feminist icon in the way later generations might want to script her. She was shaped by her time, by her faith, by her belief in family, duty, and social stability. She could be conservative in instinct. She could speak the language of motherhood and responsibility in a way that didn't always match the slogans of the movements that came after her. But that's exactly why her legacy is so hard to dismiss. Because she didn't break the barrier by rejecting the world she came from. She broke it by walking straight through it, using the very roles society tried to confine her to and turning them into political authority. She took the label mother and refused to let it mean silent. She took the label widow and refused to let it mean finished. She took the label first woman and refused to let it mean only woman. She made it impossible to argue that women couldn't handle national responsibility, because she had handled it while carrying burdens most of her critics could barely imagine. And still, the system's resistance didn't vanish. It simply evolved. For years after she left Parliament, the number of women in federal politics remained painfully small. The door she had forced open did not swing wide on its own. It creaked, it stuck. It required hands, many hands, to keep pushing. And that is one of the most sobering truths about firsts. They don't end the fight. They just prove the fight can be survived. Enid watched all of this from the outside, and she understood the danger of being turned into a comforting myth. A myth is harmless. A myth doesn't demand change. A myth can be celebrated while the real conditions remain the same. So she kept telling the story the way it actually was. Not a fairy tale. Not a smooth march of progress. A life of pressure, compromise, stubbornness, and cost. She also kept returning, again and again, to the human stakes, because that was always her weapon against political abstraction. She had seen what happened when governments treated welfare as a moral weakness instead of a social necessity. She had seen how quickly personal responsibility becomes a cruel joke when illness hits, when a breadwinner dies, when prices rise faster than wages. She had lived the terror of instability, and she never forgot it. That memory, sharp, practical, unsentimental, was the engine of her public life long after she stopped holding office. And then, as the decades moved on, the country began to rewrite its own memory of her. In the public imagination, Enid Lyons became a symbol. The first woman in the federal ministry, the first woman in cabinet, the first woman to do what had been declared impossible. Her name was spoken alongside another first from the same election year, Dorothy Tangney, the first woman elected to the Senate. 2 women entering a national parliament that had been designed without them in mind. But symbols can be flattened. And Enid's life refuses to stay flat, because behind the first is a woman who had been poor, who had been young and overwhelmed, who had been pregnant again and again, who had buried a husband in the glare of national attention, who had walked into a parliament that expected her to fail, and who had kept going anyway. If you want a single image that captures the violence of what she endured and the force of what she did, picture this: a widow in black. Sulfur still raising children, stepping into a chamber full of men who had spent their lives practicing authority and speaking as if she belonged there. Not asking, not pleading, stating. That is what she gave Australia. Not just a policy record, not just a list of titles, but a new picture of what authority could look like. And then, inevitably, the story narrows toward its final constraint. Age. The body that had carried 12 pregnancies, years of travel, years of stress, years of public performance, could not be negotiated with forever. The mind could remain sharp, the will could remain stubborn, but time does what it does. Friends and contemporaries disappeared. The political world moved on, as it always does, hungry for the next headline, the next crisis, the next personality. Enid Lyons lived long enough to see the early waves of a new era, long enough to watch Australia shift, to watch arguments about women's roles grow louder, to watch the country begin, slowly, to accept that the presence of women in national decision-making was not a novelty, but a necessity. And yet she also lived long enough to see how slow change can be, how easily a nation congratulates itself for one breakthrough, while leaving the structure mostly intact. On 2nd September 1981, Enid Lyons died. 84 years. A life that began in the last years of the 19th century and ended in a country that barely resembled the one she had entered as a young Tasmanian girl. A life that had crossed poverty and prominence, domesticity and power, grief and influence. And here is the final turn, the one that makes her story land with a quiet punch. Enid Lyons didn't just fight to be included. She fought to redefine what counted as important once you were inside. She forced Parliament to hear about the cost of living not as a statistic, but as a family's weekly dread. She forced the national conversation to treat pensions and benefits not as handouts, but as dignity. She forced a political culture built on masculine performance to confront a different kind of strength. Endurance, clarity, moral insistence. Her legacy isn't only that she was first. It's that she proved the first could be competent, strategic, relentless, and human without apology. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the challenge she left behind, hanging in the air like an unfinished sentence. If one woman could do all of that, while being doubted, minimized, and watched for failure, then what exactly was everyone else's excuse?